Ah, this one's from when I was a kid. It's not something I talk about much or even think about really. Whenever I do, it gives me an icky feeling inside. Hard to describe. Maybe writing it down will give me some measure of release or whatever, but who knows? I went to a boarding school out in the suburbs. I was there starting in 8th grade, and I ended up staying through most of high school. I shared a room with this kid named Weston. We weren't close at first, just kind of thrown together like everyone else. But over time, we got used to each other. The room itself was basic, 2 beds, 2 desks, and a tiny shared closet. After a few weeks, I started picking up on some weird stuff about Weston. For starters, he gave me a list of items I wasn't allowed to bring back to the room. Completely out of the blue, too. Like he just walked up to me with a folded piece of paper, as if it were some customary thing to be expected of a roommate. As if that wasn't strange enough, the list itself was even stranger. There were a bunch of random things on it that didn't even remotely make sense. I can't remember all of it, but apparently I wasn't allowed to bring frogs into the room, as if I ever had any intention of doing that. I didn't even know where anyone would even find a frog, let alone why they would bring it into their room. But the strangest thing on the list by far was salt. You don't eat salt, so I couldn't imagine why he'd feel the need to tell me that. What, did he think I'd just bring a salt shaker to the room for no reason? That was absurd. Plus, it was frowned upon to bring any food items back to your dorm, which added to the mystery. And beyond that, what kind of problem could salt even pose in the first place? As far as I knew, salt allergies weren't a thing, so I couldn't imagine what he was trying to avoid with that one. It was just bizarre, especially because of how serious he was about it. You might be thinking it was his form of a joke, but I'm telling you, this kid did not know what humor was. He also had this habit of muttering to himself, not just occasionally, like full-on whispering under his breath, especially at night when the lights were off. I'd catch little pieces of it sometimes, like he was talking to someone, but there was never anyone else in the room. It was really freaky at first, especially when he accidentally woke me up while doing it. But like everything else, I eventually got used to it. He also kept this little notebook, which wasn't anything crazy, until I realized what was in it. The way he'd never let anyone see it made me think it was something embarrassing or personal, but I was wrong. I knew for a fact that he kept it buried under his mattress, and my curiosity swelled over this time, ultimately getting the better of me. One day when he was out of the room, I felt around under his mattress until I found it. The vast majority of it was empty, but there were a few pages that had writing on them. It took me all of 2 seconds to realize what I was looking at. It was a long list of names, and a bunch were scratched out. I read through it and realized that a bunch of the names were kids I knew from school. I frantically scanned it for my name, and I was horrified to actually find it in there, on one of the last pages. It wasn't crossed out, which I figured was a good thing, but I had no idea what any of it meant. There wasn't anything else in there though, just the names, most of which were not crossed out. I tried deciphering it, but there was nothing special about the list. As I was putting it back, I couldn't help but wonder why someone would be so secretive over something so harmless. Were it not for the way Weston protected that thing with his life, I probably would have brushed it off as a list of people he didn't like at school or something. But for whatever reason, seeing that list gave me this really sick feeling inside, like Weston was more than just a socially awkward kid. For weeks after that, I was extremely paranoid that he somehow knew what I had done, and I started worrying that he was going to do something to me. We didn't interact much to begin with, but I could have sworn I caught him glaring at me much more often than he ever had. This unexplainable sense of fear started hanging over me, and I gradually spent more and more time outside my dorm. I had a decent amount of friends, and it got to a point where I was spending more time in my friends' dorms than my own. Then one night, something happened that made all my paranoia feel justified. I woke up randomly in the middle of the night. I had no idea what time it was, but it was pitch black outside, and I couldn't see anything. At first, I thought I had woken up to Weston's muttering again, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I realized the reality was much worse. Weston wasn't muttering. That's because instead, he was literally towering over my bed, just standing there in the dark, smiling. His hands were slightly raised, like he was about to do something, but had frozen mid-motion. I screamed. I couldn't help myself, and I sat up in the bed. Despite my outburst, he didn't stop smiling. He didn't even flinch at my scream. He just kept looking down at me, without even altering his stance. The shock of having been woken up like that was one thing, but the way he didn't even react made it even scarier. When I finally demanded to know what he was doing, he just said I'd been talking in my sleep. Like that shell of a response somehow explained everything. Like it was totally normal to be standing over someone's bed at 2 in the morning. I didn't know what to say. I was still partly in shock, and the way he kept smiling, even after explaining himself, discouraged me from asking any more questions. He went back to his bed without another word. I stayed awake the rest of the night, and not by choice. The next morning, I tried bringing it up. I felt more comfortable and honestly more safe asking him about it now that there was daylight in the room. But he acted confused, like he genuinely didn't know what I was talking about. Not in an angry way either, more in like an okay man, whatever you say kind of way. Like he thought I was making it up as some kind of joke. I couldn't decide whether he was just a really good liar or whether he truly didn't remember the incident. I couldn't decide which was worse. After that, my fear only got worse, and not just of Weston. It's hard to explain, but I started being afraid of the room itself, like his presence had infected it somehow. Even when he wasn't there, I felt uncomfortable in my own dorm. Things only got worse. About a week later, I came back to the room one night to find a small garden snake on my bed. I'm not kidding, there was a live snake on my bed. I again screamed and looked over at Weston, who was just sitting there at his desk with this blank expression on his face. He actually apologized this time and said that it was just meant to be a harmless prank, but I didn't take it that way. When I asked where he'd even gotten a snake in the first place, he looked at me all confused and said something I will never forget. He said, "What do you mean, they're everywhere?" I didn't know what to say to that. I was worried that if I said the wrong thing, he might actually try to hurt me. I had never seen a single snake on campus, but we were surrounded by woods, so maybe he was right. But what really freaked me out was when he opened this jar on his desk, and the snake just slithered right in all on its own, like it wanted to be captured. I didn't understand how a wild animal would just do that. The whole thing, from finding the snake to his creepy response, to the way it behaved, was freaky. Freakier than I'm describing it. I didn't report it. My young and naive self just couldn't get over what Weston would do if I got him in trouble. That's the thing you have to remember. I was just so young. I was 13. I wasn't old enough to know how to deal with the situation. The breaking point came from a few nights later. It started with what I thought was a nightmare. I was in sleep paralysis, totally unable to move, and there was this dark mass swirling around the ceiling. It was kind of like a blob and kind of like a cloud, and it was pulsing like it was alive, or at least breathing. It kept shifting and moving, and I could only watch as it started descending toward my bed. Then this claw, or something like a claw, emerged from the mass and started scratching at my bed frame. And then it started reaching for me. But before it could grab me, it suddenly recoiled like something had burned it or scared it off. And then it went completely crazy. It started flying around the room really fast, like it was angry or wounded. It knocked a bunch of stuff off our desks and rummaged through our closet. And in one abrupt motion, it flew towards the window and smashed right through it, disappearing into the darkness outside. The second I heard the shattering glass, my eyes snapped open. Only my neck was already pointed in the direction of the window, like I had been facing that way the whole time. And all at once, I realized why that was so terrifying. The window was actually shattered. What's worse was that there were shards of glass falling to the floor in real time, like it had just been broken moments ago. The rest of the room looked identical to what the scene in my dream had looked like. It was a perfect one-to-one match. Despite being confident that I was now awake, I still couldn't move, but it was the most terrifying moment of my life. I tore my eyes away from the window and realized there were long scratches in my bed frame, in the exact spot that claw in my dream had scraped. The fear didn't go away, but the paralysis did. As soon as I could move again, my first thought was that Weston had done it somehow. I went to his bed, but he was fast asleep. He was even snoring, but I wasn't going to let him fool me again. I started shaking him, knowing he was faking it, but he didn't wake up. I kept shaking him, and the longer he stayed asleep, the more desperately I wished he'd wake up. It was such a nasty feeling. I was both deathly terrified of him, and deathly terrified of what it would mean if he hadn't been behind the whole thing. If my nightmare hadn't been a nightmare. The moment I started thinking about that possibility, I started shaking. I wanted to be able to blame him for what had happened, or at least have some other person to make me feel less lonely and afraid. But he didn't wake up. It was too much for me to handle. I went back to my bed, curled up in a ball, and started crying. I didn't know what else to do. The broken window was real. The ransacked room was real. The scratches in the bed frame were real. A few minutes later, Weston finally woke up. He seemed genuinely shocked at the state of the room. I thought that meant we were in it together. But no. Instead, he accused me of having gone through his stuff, and we got into a screaming match. I couldn't believe he was trying to blame the whole thing on me when he was the psychotic one. He started hissing at me like a cat, and then he started yelling in a foreign language, one I had never heard before. It was not normal. Normal people don't do that. I felt like he was about to attack me. Things get kind of blurry after that. The RA showed up at our door, probably because of all the noise, and he escorted both of us out. I ended up sleeping in a vacant room that night. When I woke up the next morning, I was freezing. It took me a few seconds to realize why. The window in that room was wide open, even though I definitely remember it being closed. No one else was supposed to be in there. That was the nail in the coffin. My brain was already working on a rational explanation for what had happened the night before, but seeing that open window destroyed it all. One of the RAs told me to go get my things from my old room. When I got there, all of Weston's stuff was already gone. He must have cleared it out earlier that morning. Nobody told me what was going on. The administration just moved me to a different room with a different roommate. When I asked about Weston, they said he was no longer my concern. I never saw him again. Honestly, I don't remember much about the remainder of my time at that school. I think my brain just shut everything down and locked everything out as a last resort or some kind of coping mechanism. I don't think I'll ever know what was wrong with that kid Weston, but I don't care. I've thought of every possible explanation for what happened that night, and none of them make any sense. The window was broken from the inside. Anything that might have smashed it from the outside would have been lying on the floor. And I have trouble convincing myself that it was Weston. Not only because of how heavily he had been sleeping, but also because of how quickly I had woken up after the nightmare. I would have seen him rushing back to his bed. Something abnormal happened that night, and it terrifies me to think that I might have witnessed it, that my nightmare hadn't been a nightmare. When I was little, my parents would send me to my grandparents' farm in Pennsylvania for 2 weeks every summer. The house sat on 40 acres of mostly woods. It was honestly more woods than farm. My cousin Francisca would come for different weeks because our parents wanted to give our grandparents a break between visits. I always went first 2 weeks of July. He always went last 2 weeks of August. The house had 3 floors, but the 3rd floor was just an attic with one finished room that used to be my dad's when he was my age. That's where I slept. The ceiling slanted down on both sides, and there was one window that overlooked the backyard into the woods. My grandparents went to bed early, usually before 9. My parents told me it was rude to stay up past them, so I'd stay in my room after they wished me goodnight. I wouldn't sleep, though. I would stay up reading with a flashlight or playing my Game Boy. There wasn't much else to do there. The first summer went by without incident, but I started noticing weird things the second summer I was there. On one of the first nights, I was reading in bed when I heard footsteps on the attic stairs. They sounded soft, like someone was trying to be quiet. I watched as the door handle turned and pushed open about 6 inches. As soon as I saw the door opening, I shut my light off and pretended to be asleep. I honestly thought it was my grandma coming to check on me, and I was worried that I'd get in trouble if she found out I was awake. But I didn't hear anything after that. No receding footsteps or the sound of the door closing. I forced myself to sleep, assuming I had either missed my grandma leaving or she was still watching me for whatever reason. The next morning, I told my grandpa about the footsteps. He said the house was old and made noises, and that raccoons sometimes got in the walls. I thought that was an especially strange explanation because I was pretty sure I had seen the door handle turn, but I didn't want to say that. The footsteps were far too soft to be his anyway, so I just assumed it was my grandma, and he wasn't actually aware of it. 3 nights later, I woke up, Or at least, I thought I woke up because my bed was shaking. There was someone standing at the foot of my bed. It was dark, but I could see their outline. I couldn't tell which of my grandparents it was, but it still scared me nonetheless. I closed my eyes and silently counted to 100. When I opened them, the person was gone. I convinced myself it had just been a nightmare, but it didn't feel like one. When I woke up the next morning, my closet door was open, even though I knew it had been closed the night before, which made me doubt whether I had truly been asleep. I started suspecting my grandma was spying on me while I was asleep, as stupid as that sounds. It was the only explanation that made sense to me. Elderly people don't always have the best control over their minds after all. It was scary, but I didn't want to bring it up to my grandparents again out of fear of upsetting or disrespecting them. Similar things happened periodically over the course of that week and the next, and when it came time to go home, I was relieved. When my mom picked me up, I told her everything. She laughed and said it was impossible to get my grandma out of bed after she fell asleep. Then she told me I had an active imagination and that old houses were creepy. She said Francisco never complained about anything when he stayed there. That made me feel like maybe I really was just imagining things. I went back the next summer, and the same things happened. I never actually saw my grandma's face, but I knew it was her. I started going to sleep much earlier to reduce the risk of being awake for something creepy to happen. Years went by. My parents stopped sending me to my grandparents' farm after a certain age, and a big part of me was relieved. My grandparents passed away when I was in college within mere weeks of each other. The funeral was the most depressing thing ever. Besides how sad it was, I had to converse with a bunch of relatives I hadn't seen in years, which I wasn't thrilled about. One such relative was Francisco, who I actually hadn't interacted with much even though we were around the same age. It took less than a minute for me to realize I had nothing in common with him. Besides our age, the only thing we really did have in common was our shared time at the farm. So I asked him about it, not really knowing what else to talk about and feeling like something related to our grandparents was a valid topic of conversation. I told him about what I had experienced there, the footsteps, the figure, the closet door. I even told my theory about it being our grandma. I expected him to laugh or maybe agree with me, but I was wrong. With a blank expression, he said, and I'll never forget this, "That's nothing. That thing used to touch me." I listened in horror as he described things that were categorically worse than what I had experienced. He said the same figure would stand at the foot of his bed every few nights, but it didn't just watch him like it watched me. He would feel the mattress sink down like it was sitting. Then he would feel fingers on his face, tracing his features. Sometimes it would grab his wrist and hold it. He said he kept his eyes shut and remained frozen in place until it left. I asked him how he knew he wasn't one of our grandparents, and he said, almost like it was obvious, that he could feel it, that the thing that was touching him had rough and scratchy hands, unlike either of our grandparents. I looked at him in shock. I genuinely couldn't believe what he was telling me. Why would he keep something like that to himself? I asked him that, and he said he didn't, that he told his mom about the occurrences several times. She didn't believe him, and actually got mad when he'd complain about it to her. So he stopped talking about it and told himself that as long as he kept his eyes closed and didn't move, everything would be okay. Hearing him tell me that was quite literally horrifying. Not only did it confirm everything I myself had been experiencing, but it made things so much worse. Francisco and I stopped talking about it after that, and I could tell both of us just wanted to forget about the shared nightmare, leave it in the past with the rest of our childhood. But if it wasn't my grandma who was coming into my room at night, I don't like thinking about what it could mean. The way Francisco described it as a thing, something that still freaks me out. But is it any better thinking about how it might have been a human being? That would mean there was a person my grandparents didn't know about, living in their house for years. I don't know which is worse. When I was 9 years old, I lived with my parents in a narrow townhouse squeezed between two identical buildings. My bedroom was on the 3rd floor with a window that looked directly into the house behind ours. The houses were so close that I could see straight into the room across from mine, which was maybe 20 feet away at most. For the longest time, there was never anyone in the window, but I used to look through it every so often out of curiosity anyway. One day, there actually was someone in the window. It was a girl. She looked to be about my age with dark hair and a ponytail. The other thing I remember about her was that she was wearing a yellow sweater. She waved at me and I waved back. Then she stepped out of the frame of the window. After that, we would wave every day after I got home from school. She was always there at 3:30, like she was waiting, and she always wore the same yellow sweater. We played games through the windows. She would hold up drawings, and I would guess what they were. I would show her my homework, and she would give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. On warm days, I would open my window and try talking to her, but she never opened hers. She would just smile and point to her ear like she couldn't hear through the glass. I figured her parents were strict about keeping the windows closed. One day, I asked my mom about the girl. My mom said the Murphys lived there, an older couple with no kids. I told her about the girl, and she said maybe they had a granddaughter visiting. That made me kind of sad, because it meant she would probably disappear one day. But she didn't. She was there almost every day at around exactly the same time, and we played our games for 30 minutes to an hour before she would walk out of view. A few weeks later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to tapping. I walked over to my window and realized it was the girl. She was at her window, which was strange because I had never seen her at any time other than right after school. She wasn't smiling like she normally was. She pointed down at something I couldn't see and put her hands together like she was begging. I didn't know what she wanted, but it started to scare me, so I crawled back into bed. The tapping continued for a few more minutes and then stopped. She wasn't at the window for 3 days after that. I started thinking I had upset her by ignoring her that night. But then on the 4th night, the tapping woke me again. This time she was pressing both hands against the glass. Her mouth was moving like she was saying something, but I wasn't able to hear her since her window was closed. Her breath fogged up the window, which was strange because it was the middle of May and warm. She kept mouthing the same words. It honestly looked like she was saying, "Help me." Then she stepped back, and I saw something that made me freak out. There was a dark stain on her yellow sweater, like a blotch of paint or mud. I ran to my parents' room, almost crying. My dad ran to my room and looked out my window, but the light was off and the girl wasn't in the window anymore. My parents convinced me it was just a nightmare and told me to go back to sleep. The next afternoon, after the girl didn't show up in the window, I climbed our back fence and saw Mrs. Murphy in her garden. I smiled and waved, and she looked happy to see me, even though we had never met. I asked her about the girl in the 3rd floor room. She stopped smiling, set down her watering can, and walked a little closer to the fence. The way she stopped smiling so abruptly kind of scared me. She asked how long I had been seeing her. I told her a few weeks. She asked what this little girl looked like, and I described her dark hair and yellow sweater, and how she never opened her window. Then Miss Murphy told me to go back inside. I thought I was in trouble. Things changed a lot after that day. I was pretty sure Mrs. Murphy called my mom, which made me think I was in trouble even more. My parents moved my bed to the opposite wall that same night. They hung thick curtains over my window, the heavy kind that blocked all the light. When I asked why, they said it was to help me sleep better. But I knew something was wrong. The next day, on the way home from school, my mom told me I couldn't play the waving game anymore. When I asked why, she just said I was too old for imaginary friends. I told her she wasn't imaginary, that I had seen her for months. My mom just repeated that I couldn't go to the window anymore. I was so confused and honestly hurt. No one would explain anything to me. My friend was gone. She never appeared in the window again. My parents acted like I had done something wrong by seeing her. Not like I could express my feelings to them anyway. I was disobeying them by just going to the window in the first place. We moved like a year later. It wasn't until I was in high school that my mom finally explained things to me. Or, more specifically, what Mrs. Murphy had told her. Apparently, the previous owners had a daughter named Jenna. She was 11 when she was hit by a car right in front of the house. It happened just after school, and she was wearing a yellow sweater on that fateful day. The family moved out shortly after. When the Murphys bought the house, they tried to use that 3rd floor room, but ended up sealing it completely after things kept happening. My mom didn't really elaborate on that part. I don't think she knew. She just said that Mrs. Murphy had always been very spiritual. I'm 34 now. I live in a house with no windows facing other buildings. That's not an accident. I developed a kind of phobia for windows. Reflective surfaces, too. I've had a couple dreams about that girl in the window over the years. It's never a bad dream. I never see her with a stain on her sweater like I had that one night. But she doesn't smile in my dreams like she used to smile at me. This will forever be one of those freaky experiences that just doesn't have an explanation.